Welcome everyone this morning. You've made it to Tuesday of conference, so we're doing well. My name's Harry.
Whoop.
The energy.
Exactly.
My name's Harry Coulter-Pinner. I'm Interim Executive Director here at IPPR, and it's my absolute pleasure to be hosting today's conversation. Thank you to Energy UK for supporting this event and enabling us to be here today. I'm delighted to be on the stage with both Ed Miliband, Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, who did an amazing speech yesterday, and Heather Boucher from the Council of Economic Advisors, who's made the journey all the way across the pond to be with us here. So welcome to both of you. We're going to do this as a bit of an in-conversation. So I'm going to start with you, Ed. I think we're 82 days, if my maths is correct, 82 days in, around 80 days in. How's it going? It seems like you've been incredibly busy and you've already kind of hit the ground running and delivering quite a lot. What's your reflection 80 days in on how it's going?
Well, first, let me just say briefly thank you to you, IPPR, and the brilliant job you are doing. It's just such an important role that you are playing, even more important in government than in opposition, but you were really helpful to us in opposition. And also, I think it's just an absolutely massive privilege to have you here, Heather. I've known Heather a long time. I think for those of you who don't know, she's not simply the person who is implementing the Inflation Reduction Act quite brilliantly and setting an example to the world on what clean energy can do in terms of jobs and growth, but she was really the originator and one of the kind of founding mothers, if that's the right phrase, of the whole idea of middle-hour economics, which is such an important lesson for us to learn. So it's fantastic to have you here. Look, on your question, so my motto is move fast and build things. That's sort of the lesson maybe I learned from the US experience. You know, we've got clarity of mission, which I think is so important in government. You know, speed, I think, is the hardest thing in government to move to, you know, Jack Straw once said to me, there's always 1,000 good reasons not to do something in government, and you have to overcome the 1,000 good reasons not to do something. The multiple points of, you know, veto, slow down, people who just sort of say, oh, you know, is that a bit risky? And so just sort of moving forward fast is so important. And then, and I take this very much from the US experience, rooted in values. You know, if we win the fairness argument, we win the clean energy net zero argument. If we lose the fairness argument, we lose. And so, you know, doing this in a way that is fair is so important. I think the only other thing I'd say is, you know, I do think that, and it's maybe slightly different in the UK than the US, but as I keep saying, that the most important thing, I think, is that we've built an argument about the clean energy sprint, which is an energy security, bills, jobs and growth, and climate argument, not simply a climate argument. And I think that is the way you sort of maximize your coalition, and that's the kind of coalition we're carrying forward.
And just tell us a bit about what inspiration you've taken from the IRA and the action that President Biden has taken. You've obviously got an ambitious mission, investment, industrial policy. A lot of that seems to me to have got some shared DNA.
Definitely. Look, you know, we're not the US. The US is a much bigger country, different in all kinds of ways. But I think massive inspiration on a number of levels. I think, first of all, when President Biden, I think when he was running for president, said, when I think of climate, I think of jobs. And I think that you know, always remember him saying that. And I think that, you know, reframing the climate argument as the greatest economic opportunity of the 21st century, I think that's first. Secondly, I think you've pioneered the case for catalytic public investment. So a rejection of the notion that public investment crowds out private investment, the argument of the right, but actually an argument that public investment can crowd in private investment. And that's very much what the Chancellor believes. I know you're doing an event with her later, and she's a brilliant advocate for this agenda. So I think secondly, crowding in. And then thirdly, I think the other thing that is so interesting is the way in which you are using tax policy, and in our case, not so much tax policy, but subsidy and other tools to influence where jobs are created. You'll say this better than I do, but the way in which the private investment has been directed at those areas of the country that have fallen behind, I think that is such an important lesson, because simply saying public investment to crowd in private investment is one thing, but crowd in where and for whom? So there are some of the lessons that I take.
And Heather, I'm going to come to you now. I think we can probably assume that quite a lot of people know the basics, but maybe just give us a brief overview of what President Biden and with your support has done. But then what I think would be really interesting to hear is what your advice to Ed and colleagues in the UK are about taking forward this agenda here in the UK.
Yeah, so thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much. And thank you, IPR and everyone for hosting this. It's been so amazing over the past few days to learn about what you all are doing and the lessons, but also the shared values and the shared goals that we have. Let me start with, the president did say on the campaign, when he rolled out his climate agenda, when I think of climate, I think of jobs. And that is indicative of how we have thought about our economic agenda from day one. And it gets to the president when he talks about the economy, he talks about how he wants to grow the economy from the middle out and bottom up. And what he means by that is the following. You laid this out in a speech last week. First, the purpose of our economic policy is to improve the lives of workers, families, communities. It is a worker-first approach. That is the outcome that we want to see, is improved living standards, and we do that through creating good jobs, through making it possible for people to join unions, giving them the opportunities that they need to succeed, but making that possible. So that is the outcome, and there's a lot of policy around that. Second, is that we need to make sure that as we are thinking about the economy, that we're shaping markets to be fair and competitive. And we have a lot of tools at our disposal to do that, from the antitrust agenda to how we think about the regulatory state, and how importantly how we think about global trade and the role of the global trading system. What is fair and competitive, and what does it mean when we know that the world all needs to move to new ways of producing and using energy, and that is in everything we do. You look out I'm looking out this window here, and it's like, well, there's vehicles, those all need to change, to moving away from fossil fuels to electricity. We've got buildings that all need to change, how we think about heating and cooling in the built environment. Roads and bridges, those are all need to be adapted to climate. Like, everything around us is connected to this new economic agenda. But as we are doing this, how are we making sure that we're making space for those infant industries domestically in all of our economies, but making sure that we're also, taking in the best that capitalism can give us, which is new ideas, new innovation, and getting things to, moving down those learning curves so that things are affordable, right? So you have a massive opportunity, and competition is the crux of that, both domestic and globally. So first, it's workers first. And it's fair competition, and then we are investing in strategic sectors. And this is where climate comes in and clean energy, but the way we've thought about it, the way the president talks about it, is that we need to make foundational investments in our infrastructure. For decades, we had not been making the investments we needed to make, literally bridges falling down across America. I live in one of the richest countries the world has ever seen, and to have bridges fall down is just unacceptable. To have lead still in our water system, unacceptable. So we had a lot of those sorts of things, and then we had new infrastructure we need to build, getting everyone access to broadband and the like to move into the 21st century. So infrastructure, and then making strategic investments in specific sectors that are important for economic growth and economic competitiveness. New technology, semiconductors. It is imperative that we have the capacity to participate in the global supply chain around semiconductors. Clean energy. We have to use our tools in the United States to build out these clean energy industries. And again, we can use our resources, our investments in innovation to push down those cost curves by getting things to commercialization at scale. We believe that in doing so and in lowering those costs, we're going to make it easier for countries around the world to adopt those technologies, to be able to manufacture them themselves. That is a really important role we're playing. So those are the three planks of what we've done. Workers, empowering workers, fair competition, and investing in America. And climate is at the core of it, but it is a modern American industrial strategy where we are, and Chancellor Reeves said this yesterday, what we make and how we make it matters. The composition of our economy matters. And for too long, the economics community, we forgot that what we make in our economies is actually where we add value. It's what is important. It's what kinds of jobs we're creating, what kind of local economic development we have, what and how, what kinds of jobs are we creating? Are we creating pollution? Those two tenets are at the core of what we do, and addressing clean energy is at the foundation of that. We believe that's going to lead us to productivity gains to years to come. Lessons for the UK: move fast, but don't break anything. Be disruptive, but don't break things. In the sense that we all have to move fast. But the biggest challenge in front of us, given the scale and scope, is that we need to make sure, I often think of this as, my mom never needs to understand the true challenges in front of us of moving to a clean energy economy or climate change if we are successful, because we as policymakers can do this smoothly. We can make sure that we're smoothing out the edges, that the challenges of how people like my mom need to think about where they're getting energy and if they need a heat pump, we need to make that as easy as possible for them. And for our economy, because we don't want to, we want to smooth any shocks, right? And that's a big part of what we're doing. Yes, go ahead.
Can I come on that, just to bring Ed in, which is to say, we've seen in other countries that there's been a backlash to some climate policies, thinking of Germany recently here, partly because of the communications challenges around it, but also because sometimes the policy and the distribution of cost doesn't work, or the support for groups isn't there. How do we make sure that we, in Heather's words, move quickly, but make sure that we don't engender a backlash?
This is why I think it's only centre-left governments and centre-left governments with muscular industrial distributional policies can actually deliver this transition. Because the truth about the transition is it has benefits and burdens, and unless they're fairly shared, it's just not going to work. Yeah. All of the polling, Luke Trill's polling from More in Common in particular, shows the public is with us absolutely on this argument. In Britain, I think what is so striking is now when you ask people, are we better off sticking to fossil fuels, or are we better off switching to renewables? People say by significant majorities, because of the experience of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what happened to the cost of living, people by significant majorities say we're better off moving to renewables. So, we have a sort of foundational support for this, but people aren't, people are in a cost of living crisis, a long-term cost of living crisis, and therefore, unless you make it, fair, and also unless you make people better, I think we can make people better off.
Yeah.
But it requires government to shoulder some of the burden, to collectivize the burden of this.
Yeah.
I think that's the lesson, from the countries around the world that are struggling. I'm not saying it's easy, because we're in a very fiscally constrained environment, but that's the lesson I draw from countries around the world.
Can I follow up with you, Heather, and just say, there's not getting the backlash, there's then getting the credit when it's going right. And I think the question that we hear a lot, thinking about the US experience, is your economy's booming, it's doing really well. And the IRA's gone through and it's delivering. But there's this critique that the Democrats aren't getting any political dividend from that in terms of increased political support. What's your take on that? What's your response to that?
So I think a few answers. I think it's really important to acknowledge that it takes time. We weren't able to get the Inflation Reduction Act done until August of 2022, so a full 19, 20 months into the term. So it took us time to get that across the finish line. It also takes time for these investments to play out. And we've had $910 billion of announced investment in clean energy and semiconductors in our new modern American industrial strategy. That has been followed up by historic investments in the construction of new manufacturing facilities, 6 quarters of historic investments at a scale and scope we haven't seen in going back to when we started collecting this data in 1956. And yet we know it will take, by our internal estimates, about 6 to 8 quarters for the manufacturing jobs to show up in communities. And that means that those will start showing up this fall, this winter. And that's just starting to show up. So it's one, is it takes time. Pardon me?
That's post-election.
Post-election, but Yeah. But the second thing is that this is a local economic development story. And, the narrative has been laid out by in the press coming out of New York and Washington, and economists sitting at their desks, sort of guessing at, what this would look like. But the story of what this is a local economic development story. It is what's happening in places all across the country. And I and my colleague have been traveling now to 15 states across the country and seeing the on-the-ground benefits. These benefits are disproportionately going to communities that need it most, disproportionately going to communities that are lower income, that are less likely to have a college degree, where people are less likely to have a college degree. Places that are, we're doing roundtables with electeds from both sides of the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans coming together, who are excited about the vitality that is coming to their community. They can see what's happening on the ground, but they're still building it. So it hasn't bubbled out yet. But I think one thing that is really important here, and the intersection between building a clean energy economy and middle out, is so imperative to keep that connection in our minds, because the long-standing economic argument was that econ policymakers should focus on making sure that markets can work their magic, and we should get out of their way. And then they will deliver these optimal outcomes. What they didn't deliver was equity. What they didn't deliver was jobs across our economies, and they did not deliver the industries that our economies needed, right? We saw that during the pandemic. That is the lesson of the pandemic. But in the media, we are still up against a set of econ thought leaders that are asking a lot of questions about what we're doing. I call them the what about questions. We're getting a lot of, well, what about this? What about that? Yes, it's been successful, but can it last? Yes, it's been successful, but you're picking winners and losers. Yes, but well, a lot of doubt, because there's a lot of questions. And it's really important that we have these debates. It's really important that we investigate these questions. It's our job to do the best policy we can do, right? But we have shown that our $370 billion of, over 10 years in clean energy tax credits is now leveraging in hundreds of billions of private dollars into the industries that we need to build for the future, in the places that need the jobs, creating opportunity, connecting those dots. And we need to help the econ community understand that you can have a middle-out agenda that works. You can say to capital, you can say to your economy, let's invest in these sectors, let's direct it, let's make sure it's fair and competitive, let's create that, but that we can have this win-win. And we can do it by also building out a global set of clean energy industries that we can work together so that we can all have that economic security that comes from access to safe, clean, and affordable energy.
You wanted to come in?
Yeah, I just want to ask you a question. I heard you on the Volts podcast last week, and I think, is it the figure that, is it 4 out of 5 of the investments or the jobs are in red states, in Republican states?
Yes.
So maybe just talk to us about that. I mean, is there an electoral, look, we're doing this because this is the right thing to do, but is there a discernible electoral effect? If there isn't as much of an electoral effect as we might expect or hope, is that because it's not connected to what Washington is doing? It's too distant? Is it because it hasn't, because it's still in train? What's your analysis of that?
Well, I would say, A, we're coming up on an election, so we'll see how it goes. B, we had an election in 2022 where, in the U.S. context, our presidentials are every 4 years, but then we have congressional elections every 2 years, and the midterm elections are generally very bad for the party in power. Joe Biden did the best in a midterm election going back to any election over 200 years, except like 1 or 2. This was one of the best midterm elections ever. So the idea that somehow we're unpopular is a little, now granted, it wasn't all like this that made that happen. There's a lot of other things. There's a big abortion debate and all that. But it's also difficult to say, wow, it's been super unpopular. But here's the thing. We have had almost half a century of rising economic inequality. We have had decades of deindustrialization, which has affected places across our economy. People are frustrated that the economy has not been delivering for them. It's not been delivering the kind of economic security that they need, that they deserve. It hasn't been delivering the industries that we need. And you can't fix 50 years of economic
That's really true.
direction in 18 months. But you can make progress. And when you look at the inequality stats, I don't talk about those on stage normally because I think that these are long-term trends, but things are moving in the right direction. Over the past 16, 17 months, as we've pulled out of, as wages have pulled ahead of inflation, workers at the bottom end of the wage distribution have seen their wages rise faster than overall. Will that trend continue? It's one I'm watching very, very closely, but we're seeing movement in the right direction. And I think it is important that we are governing for all of America. And the only way that we can fix inequality across places is to really make sure that we're investing on places no matter who they voted for. That is a Joe Biden value that I just gives me joy.
Before, I'm going to hand over in a second to the second half of our panel. You get twice the amount of fun here at IPPR. But before I do, Ed, I just wanted to ask you, hearing a bit about Heather's experience, one of the things that's clear is this is a new type of economic policy. It's not the orthodoxy. We're pushing against the orthodoxy here. How have you found...
We're inventing a new orthodoxy.
Indeed. And how have you found trying to... You were in government 15 years ago. Coming back in, how have you found trying to land that in... I'm thinking about the Treasury, I'm thinking about the kind of economists and the civil servants in the UK, trying to get a new type of economics embedded into the state?
I think in the civil service there's massive openness to this. Look, the truth about civil servants is people want direction. And, people don't come to my department to sort of not do things, they come to do things. I do think this is pioneering a different type of economics. I actually think, this is going to be a surprise to some people, look, the person who did this last time we were in government best was probably Peter Mandelson.
I knew this.
This is a me and Peter Mandelson mutual admiration society, which is very surprising for people who
he pops up if you say
who know the history. But he was the person who did industrial policy in 2008, 2009, 2010 in the Department of Business. And there was little attempts at it under the Tories. But, I think one of the most significant things a chancellor has said in the 29 years I've been coming to conference is what Rachel said yesterday, because she was sort of saying something very significant about the role of the Treasury in seeing investment not just as a cost, but a potential benefit to the country and an instrument for growth. And I think that is such an important, I think it shows what a champion she is of this agenda. That seems to me to be sort of important. So look, it can be done. I suppose the only other observation I would make, just following on from what Heather said, is it seems to me, and this is absolutely no criticism of the US administration, who I think has done outstandingly well, is I think for us, action is important, but narrative is as important.
Yes.
Explain to people what you are doing, why you are doing it, being honest about the time it takes and the journey. I actually think the right is very good at doing this. When Trump says some of his mad stuff about trade or whatever, people will say, well, he may not have achieved it, but at least he was trying. And I think narrating what we are seeking to do and why we are seeking to do it, and we are responding to an unmet demand for good jobs, good unionized jobs at good wages, we've let people down for too long and haven't provided these jobs, and they won't all come at once, but we're starting to build that different kind of economy, and we are putting our shoulder to the wheel to do everything we can to do it. Yeah. I think that is so important. And just last thing I'd say is something I emphasize to my department a lot. Delivering the jobs here as well as the clean energy is so important. If you deliver the clean energy without the jobs, we will also fail. Yeah. And the truth is that part of the problem of the last government is they delivered some of the clean energy, offshore wind, but they didn't deliver the jobs. You've got to deliver the supply chain. And that is a big responsibility on government, but it's also a big responsibility on the private sector as well to do that together.
Fantastic. We've heard it here. There's a consensus from Peter Mandelson through to Ed Miliband and the Labour Party. Thank you to Heather. Thank you to Ed. I'm delighted to welcome Becca Matthew Chase, my colleague, who will also introduce Emma and Joshua, and very proudly Luke Murphy, who was formerly of IPPR and is the first Labour MP in his constituency. Is that right? Congratulations. I'm going to hand over to you guys. Thank you.
Fantastic. Welcome. I know, what a hard act to follow. But good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, and fantastic to hear from Ed and Heather. Thank you so much. I'm really pleased now to move on to our panel discussion. Pleased to be joined by Luke Murphy MP, Emma Pinchback of Energy UK, and Joss Emden of IPPR. So we'll have some opening remarks from each of our panellists before moving on to a Q&A. So first up, I'm really pleased to welcome Luke. So Luke is the new Labour MP for Basingstoke and also chair of the APPG on climate change. And as Harry mentioned prior to entering Parliament, Luke was with us at IPPR and he headed up the Fair Transition Unit. So over to you first, Luke.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's quite a hard act to follow. I guess the one thing I'd add to what was said, and I know I've heard Ed talk about it on other panels and also Michael Shanks as well, is the mission-based approach and why that is so important to this agenda. Because when we're thinking about the clean energy target in particular, reaching that by 2030, and you think about the complexity of the issues we need to overcome, so the connections to the grid, the insufficient grid capacity, the huge issues with skills and expertise that we need, that gap that we need to fill in order to deliver on the mission, the issues in the planning system that we need to overcome, the issues with public engagement and the need to, we do, as a government, and there are lots of, I'm really proud of the cohort that I've come in under. We need to make the argument to the public of why we need all this new energy infrastructure across the country, but public engagement is also going to be a huge challenge. We heard from Ed and Heather about the very real fiscal and distributional questions that we are going to face and how we ensure that the burden and the benefits are genuinely fairly shared. And rightly, as Ed said, the government needs to be picking up and collectivising a great deal part of that and then ensuring the benefits are fairly shared. But then I was also on a panel yesterday where we were talking about the role of local authorities and combined authority mayors and the role that we're going to, industrial strategy linked to the clean energy mission fundamentally does need to be place-based. Many of the skills strategies that are going to be developed to fill the skills gaps are going to have to be done and rightly done at combined authority level as well. So I think one of the most important things that the Labour government is doing is taking that mission-based approach, because you really cannot underestimate the power of having Keir Starmer as the Prime Minister and every single relevant cabinet minister and junior minister and official around the table thinking through, okay, what are the barriers to achieving this clean energy 2030 target? And I was really delighted to hear Michael Shanks say yesterday when I was on a panel with him that him and Ed and all the team in the department are more convinced, having got into government, of their ability to get to that target than they were in opposition. But I do think that mission-based approach will be absolutely crucial. So that's probably the one thing I would add to the panel that we've just heard from.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Luke. Really pleased now to invite Emma. Emma Pinchback is the Chief Executive of Energy UK, an expert in an expert in whole economy decarbonisation and the energy transition. And so thank you very much for joining us, and really pleased to welcome you to share your thoughts.
Thank you. Also, I'm not sure my microphone is working. Is it working? It's how you give, it's Tuesday. No one expects things to work anymore. So I'll just shout while the tech guys sort that out. How do you follow that? And also I did an event here yesterday and I'm slightly worried that I'm just going to say exactly the same stuff, so I'm going to attempt to say slightly different things. Just to defend the last 10 years a bit and what we've been doing in energy, I think the UK does genuinely have a good story to tell in this space. one of the things that has troubled us over the last couple of years is actually not that we haven't been doing well or not got started, it's that we're slowing down relative to the rest of the G7 and Russia as the effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also as the pace of clean energy technologies becomes apparent to other countries. I think the US Inflation Reduction Act is part of that, but we're just facing more competition to do this in a way that we weren't 10 years ago. But we have been the first country in the world to demonstrate you can deliver decarbonisation and decouple it from economic growth. We've built the second biggest offshore wind market in the world. In the time I've been working, by the way, we've also been out to China, talked to them about offshore wind and watched them develop the biggest offshore wind market in the world, which maybe says something about economic policy. But it's been an extraordinary journey here in the UK, and a lot of that investment has been delivered by the private sector, which is why I choose to do this job as someone that cares about climate change. We also have employed thousands of people across the country. The energy sector that I represent is worth about 1 in every 48 jobs in the country, but I think we would all agree, when you think about the challenges for the next 10 years, that there hasn't been enough focus on regional investment, or what economists would call GVA, this kind of wider regional value from the investments that we're making, how we get jobs in this country. And I said this yesterday, but I think one of the challenges for the next 10 years is that conversation about value, not price necessarily. Price is important, I'll come back to it, but the additional economic benefits we get from investing early in technologies, from moving investment into communities, from making sure industry can put factories in places as well as projects, these things are not something that the private market would disagree with. If you work in a business, you understand that investment is important early in order to get growth. So I think there is something about how can we make sure that policy gets us that wider economic value, not just the kind of narrow focus on getting the price down of technologies as fast as possible and benefiting from a global market. Panic will take place. The second thing I'd say that's really important, and we haven't talked much about it at conference, and the Labour government should talk more about it, which is that from an emissions point of view, the ball game is not necessarily in clean power, it's in heat and the demand side of energy. And I think we are concerned by, worried by, would like to hear more about how we decarbonise heat in particular, but also electrify transport and other areas of the economy, and how we make those two ends of the system work together. So there's a lot of focus on building a lot of stuff. I'm here for it. I am the person that has to go on the radio and talk about pylons all the time. But I would also like to see more focus on how we make the system work together, how we build efficiently, actually how we build as little as possible by making the most of things like, batteries and more electrification on the demand side, and new services and technologies and things that are meaningful for people and make their lives easier, like the washing machine made my grandmother's life easier. It's that bit of the world I'd like to hear more about. And the last and most important thing is that as I speak to you, we've got officially £3 billion worth of debt sitting with the energy suppliers, largely from unpaid energy bills, mostly where people can't pay them and haven't been able to pay them over the last few years, even with government support. That is the official figure. It's likely to be much higher. We're seeing really deep debt in the sector. A lot of our customer situation has got worse, not better. There isn't government universal support anymore, so we think this winter is going to be really challenging. And it relates a little bit to the conversation we had previously. If people think that the energy transition makes their life more expensive, if we don't have support on bills, if we're not thinking about retail as well as infrastructure, if we're not thinking about support for our most vulnerable in society and fairness, then we will be in trouble, and not just from the energy transition, but from a cost of living point of view. And it's important to remember that energy underpins the rest of the economy. So if we don't think about price and affordability, then we're in trouble. Your tomatoes are like about 40% more expensive at the moment because of the costs of heating greenhouses and making fertilizers. So this is like an essential service. It's important to people, it's important to business, and I'd like to hear more of that sort of thinking as well. And the very last thing I'd say is those benefits won't happen immediately. We heard a lot of the conversation about the time delay. We know that investing in renewables and clean technology will deliver benefits to the economy, but it's likely the government will have to do something else in order to make sure those benefits manifest themselves earlier in the decade. And I'm not a politician, but if I were a politician, I'd be thinking about how to manifest them before the next general election.
And on that note, thank you so much, Emma. Finally, I'm really pleased to welcome Josh Emden of IPPR. Josh is a senior research fellow focused on just transition policy, heat decarbonisation, industrial decarbonisation, and green jobs and skills. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks very much. It was really heartening to hear it earlier, and actually throughout our conference as well. I think how committed the government is to these targets, these challenges, and the level of ambition is welcome because it needs to sort of match where we need to get to. I mean, on clean energy in particular, we need to be sort of either sort of doubling or tripling the amount of onshore wind we have, the amount of offshore wind we have. These are sort of huge challenges, and the return of offshore wind to the latest round of CFDs was really welcome, but we need to massively be kind of scaling up even from there, sort of to the amount of capacity that we're installing. On heat pumps, for example, I think it was in 2022, France installed something like 600,000 heat pumps, which is more than the UK has ever installed. So there's a huge challenge to kind of scaling up a lot of this technology, but it's really heartening to hear that, firstly, that the government is up for the challenge, and secondly, that they think it's going to be actually more achievable than they thought beforehand. So those are sort of really sort of heartening words to hear. I think the other thing I would say, and it feels a little bit almost small fry in comparison to some of the really kind of bold and sort of ambitious macroeconomic discussions that we had with Heather and Ed, but I guess the things that we've been focusing on at the moment is thinking about where this is going to be delivered. In particular, we're kind of doing a project on this moment, you could probably tell from the examples I'm about to draw out, but around sort of 75% of the onshore wind that we're going to need, and about, or at least 25% of offshore wind will need to come from devolved administrations. And obviously, UK has powers over infrastructure, over grid, over overall energy policy, apart from Northern Ireland, where it's sort of everything apart from nuclear. But there's still sort of planning, and there's still skills which are sort of devolved areas with limitations on funding. So there's going to need to be a really coordinated approach. And there are things that other devolved administrations are doing already that is really promising. So Scotland, for example, has a really good planning system for onshore wind at the moment. It's also starting to require some of these supply chains to be in place before a developer can go ahead, which helps with sort of setting up manufacturing. That can be really important for all the kind of manufacturing jobs that we've been talking about, all the conversations we've been having about how the UK is really good at installing, but not as good at kind of developing and building some of these things. So some of the ideas that we're having from devolved administrations could be really important. And there's also a really big need for a kind of coordinated approach on some of these things. So, I mean, some of the things that we're calling for, this is a typical kind of policy wonk kind of thing, but a sort of four nations approach, right? And what that looks like in practice, we're hoping is a sort of, cross-working team, some sort of team that's, whether it's in cross-departmental or kind of have representation from devolved administrations. There needs to be a kind of collaborative approach and a kind of team dedicated to delivering this because of the amount of renewables that are going to be developed in devolved administrations in particular. As I say, it feels a bit small fry in comparison to some of the sort of broader conversations we've been having, but in just sort of thinking about some of those delivery areas. And obviously, GB Energy is something we've mentioned, the minority stakes it might be taking things, maybe even the majority stakes it might be taking in some things. The ability to crowd in private investment is going to be absolutely crucial. Working with, Crown Estate, for example, to kind of speed up leasing. All of these things are really, really welcome. I'll give you just one example, almost just sort of to end on, which is, again, quite specific, but is just a sort of thought of how some of this implementation can start to happen. One of the things that we've identified in the offshore wind industry in particular is there's probably going to be a shortage of vessels quite soon. The actual vessels to transport from port to installing it on site. And that's going to be a kind of global shortage. So one of the things that GB Energy could do perhaps is more than just investing in generation, investing in maybe some of the enabling conditions. So if we can build a kind of, a British-owned public fleet of vessels that developers can then start to sort of hire for themselves, generating income for GB Energy, potentially also becoming an export opportunity in future. Again, feels quite specific, but just some of those ideas of how we start to sort of build and towards these ambitions.
You're getting a lot of nods there.
I like that. It was more nods than I was expecting.
It was like a bit of mutual agreement on the panel. Some really interesting reflections and some provocations. And yes, hard act to follow, but you all rose to the challenge. Thank you very much. It's not the end of the event. We're actually going to move out to the Q&A now as we get plunged into darkness. There we go. The lights come on, I can see you all better. So what I'll do is I'll take a few questions at a time. In the interest of speed, I'll direct them to our panellists, but do feel free to jump in if there's one that you want to contribute on. And there's some hands that have immediately gone up. I'm just waiting for the roving mic, fantastic. So, Olivia, if you take the one just to your left, behind you, and then fourth row from the back, there.
Yeah, thank you. Andrew Large from the Confederation of Paper Industries. I'd like to ask a question about industrial offshoring and UK emissions, because I'm very concerned that the UK ends up decarbonising by deindustrialising, and I think much of the recent drop in UK emissions is actually a little bit false, because we've offshored industrial activity and actually we're now re-importing the goods back into the UK, and they're being produced in countries where we cannot control their carbon emissions. We have no say over what their energy system looks like. To my mind, it's global carbon emissions that are the most important. And so would the panel agree with me that if in the short to medium term UK carbon emissions go up, but global carbon emissions go down, that that's actually of benefit to the planet?
We'll wait. We'll take a few. Luke, eager to get in there. I'll come to you first.
Hi there, Tom Palmer from Zenobia Energy. One of the things that's been talked about is developing and building. That's great, but there hasn't been much talk about using what we have now better. And I think the need to focus on, offshore wind, solar is great. It's easy politically, but we need to start thinking about flexibility. We build storage, it's skipped 90% of the time. So instead of importing into the battery, we turn down the wind instead. That's just a waste. But we're not looking at what we need to do in the short term to meet a 2030 target. And if we don't sort it, we're going to be at risk of the gas lobby holding us ransom for flexibility. So same with DSR. So I'd just be interested to know what your views are and how we manage the short-term goal and how we sort out the rules and systems and planning.
Thank you.
Jonathan Selwyn from Bluefield. We develop, build and operate solar and storage projects. When Ed Miliband launched the feed-in tariff, it unleashed a revolution in renewables, and together with the renewables obligation, despite the stop-start policies, we delivered gigawatts of renewables. It created thousands of jobs, but most of those jobs were not in manufacturing. And if you look forward at job creation over the next 10 years with net zero, most of the jobs will be highly skilled jobs in engineering, planning, the service sector, and so on. Slightly different to the first question, do we need to move away from this focus on manufacturing jobs and focus actually on the jobs that have been created by renewables?
And like to have a fight.
Yeah, that's right. I'd be interested for the panel's views on that.
Thank you very much. So an interesting theme emerging about long-term versus short-term there. Luke was eager to come in on that first question. So Luke, I'll come to you first.
So I guess I'd take the third and the first one. I would just say no. The other jobs that you mentioned in the service sector, in installation, in engineering, are incredibly important, and we should value them and think about those as much as we do manufacturing jobs within an industrial strategy. However, I agree with what Emma said in the sense of, we've had the energy system has probably been, well, it has been the most successful area of where we've been able to reduce our emissions over the last decade. But I know from work I did at the previous, my previous place of work, that if we had created jobs at the same level as other countries such as Denmark, we would have tens of thousands of more jobs within the renewable sector that would be high-value jobs, well-paid, high-skilled. And there is also something else. There's a wider macro argument about the economy, not just about the individual jobs, about the benefit of having manufacturing in the economy. Having a diversified economy means we have a stronger economy, and that is one of the lessons from the Inflation Reduction Act. That's one of the lessons that other countries are taking, is that actually that's how you build a stronger economy. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that we're going to expand our manufacturing share of GDP by another 10%, but a couple of percent, and ensuring that we maintain the manufacturing we have and then trying to build and grow on it, I think is incredibly important, both for the broader strength for our economy, the individual jobs we create, but also regional rebalancing. Most of these jobs are distributed very well across the country and will also help achieve that wider task of regional rebalancing. And I guess coming back to the first question, I mean, I guess that's the whole point of an industrial strategy in a sense, is that you ensure that you're not agnostic. I mean, I think as Heather highlighted, that Rachel had said that we are not agnostic about where we build and make things. And we acknowledge that actually, if you do this transition badly, you may end up reducing emissions, but you end up offshoring them. But I don't think that shouldn't point towards a strategy that is agnostic about our emissions increasing while global emissions decrease. Actually, I think you can have our emissions decreasing and global emissions decreasing, and that should be the ambition. And you can do that through an ambitious industrial strategy as well as clean energy policy allied to that. On the storage point, I mean, I would just broadly agree, you know, and going back to my initial comments, that should form part of a mission-based approach to a clean energy target for 2030, because you know, that's got to be, you know, being more efficient with what we're creating as well as demand reduction will be an incredibly important part of achieving that target.
Thanks, Luke. Emma, I'll come to you for as well. It'd be great to pick up a bit more on that sort of using what we have now better point as well.
I mean, I was thinking about a conversation I had with you, Tom, yesterday after the last IPPR event I did, where we were talking about exactly that. I think I didn't say batteries yesterday. I specifically said batteries for you. There you go. I think it is really important to look at supply and demand, and that's what I meant for those of you that aren't energy wonks in the room about. There is a lot of focus on building stuff. We do have to build a lot of stuff in pretty much every system model we've got, regardless of whether we're using a lot of flexibility and batteries and other forms of storage, and cleverly matching with smart technologies and market supply and demand. But it is unquestionable that we don't talk enough, and maybe it's because it's like really wonky, it sounds quite nerdy to say flexibility, but we don't talk enough about the value of things like locating a battery alongside a renewables development, or a factory alongside a renewables development, like being more sophisticated about how we use the system. Part of that, and they're not here, and they are now a national body, but part of that is to do with how the control room runs the system and the technologies and the approach that the control room has traditionally taken to managing supply and demand on the system. We would like to see a much more sophisticated approach, and I think now that the system operator has got this job in terms of national strategy for the energy mission, as well as thinking about where to locate new forms of generation and infrastructure, I really like them to see them thinking about flexibility in markets and rewarding technologies like Synovi's, so that we have to build less stuff because stuff is expensive and we all pay for it. So doing it efficiently is important. Can I pick up on the kind of jobs in the economy? There's like 3 parts to this answer. So on the carbon, let's do the carbon first. We track consumption emissions in the UK as well as territorial emissions. So just factually, one of the things that I'm very excited about is the decline in our emissions has been produced largely by displacing coal. I can see Pauline in the audience. Radcliffe is turning off in October. That's the last of the UK's coal-fired power fleet. And displacing coal semi-unexpectedly, actually, with renewables rather than gas, and that's where a lot of our emissions reduction has been. There's obviously been some movement of high-intensity carbon intensity manufacturing outside of the country. But in looking at the figures for consumption and territorial emissions, that is not the reason for emissions reduction in the UK, and that's why it's such a powerful story about investing in new technologies and getting change and still getting economic growth. What I would say about the carbon is we're doing lots of work on this thing called a CBAM, and so you can't tell other countries how to run their economies. You can have in place taxation at the borders, which starts to reflect fairly the cost of decarbonisation in your country versus the cost of decarbonisation in others with like less strong regimes. I can see
Sorry, was that
CBAM? Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and it's meant at the border to adjust for some of those differences in carbon policy, which should make it fairer. It's designed to get less offshoring of emissions, essentially. Adam at the back of the room, who's currently, I assume, like tweeting about all the smart things I'm saying, is an expert on the CBAM, so you can kind of grab him afterwards. But I think carbon pricing is part of the answer. For industrials, I'd also say that we represent the whole of the energy sector. One of our jobs is to try and get you cheap electricity, in particular, but to cheap energy overall, try and get manufacturing here. The last thing I'd say, though, and this is the economic answer, is the value of the energy transition by 2050 is worth about £260 billion to the UK economy. That is the size of the manufacturing sector today. China, where they have taken an early stage interest in technologies, they've done industrial development and they've kind of pushed at the energy transition. They control 80% of the key commodities for the future of the energy transition, including, amongst other things, batteries, semiconductors, offshore wind manufacturing. If you sit and look at this as a climate opportunity, a thing that's being done to you because of climate change, then you're missing the point, which is the energy sector is going to do this. It's why I'm in this job, because it is, we think, the future of energy. It's an industrial revolution, and it is really important that we get in there as early as we can. Otherwise, we will be in a situation in this country where we are dependent for our energy and the energy supply chains on an entirely different set of countries that also sit outside our borders to our existing energy system, which is already too dependent on fossil fuels from places that are not friendly to UK interests. So there is a really good reason, geopolitically, in terms of energy security, in terms of the economy, to try and do this regardless of climate change. The last thing I'd say is morally, I've got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and when I'm trying to teach them about right and wrong, I don't say, well, they're doing that really stupid thing, like trying to throw themselves out of a window. Maybe you only partially throw yourselves out of the window, or maybe you also throw yourself out of the window because that's apparently the level we're aiming for. So don't throw yourself out of the window, that's bad. Don't hit your brother, that's not a good idea. And I think there's also a kind of moral thing which you don't have to get on board with of, we know how to do this. We are a relatively wealthy country. We have to do it fairly and bring people with us, but we should just do it because it's also the right thing to do. There you go.
Emma looking at me as another parent of 2 small
Yeah,
children.
we're talking about not sleeping. Also, how much sleeps, if that was incoherent, that's also kind of...
Not at all. I'm going to come to Josh, though, to just briefly touch on the jobs and skills point, if that's okay, Josh. I know you're probably itching to say lots of other things as well.
So many other things. On the jobs and skills point, so I guess around the manufacturing piece, I think, I sort of agree with what Luke was saying. Everyone was saying about sort of the need to scale up those jobs. I think the key sort of narrative here is that, particularly in all the renewable energy industries that we know that we need, even China, which is sort of leading the way on some of these things, is not going to be able to manufacture absolutely everything. Yeah. There is a global shortage in the supply chain, and that's not just sort of driven by the invasion of Ukraine. It's partly caused like that, but it's not just that. It's also kind of scale across the world. There's global demand for manufacturing. So I think that we're going to need to play a role in that come what may, and on top of that, there's also obviously the opportunity for local jobs. We know, as Luke said, that manufacturing is a very localized story. So yeah, for that reason alone, we know that sort of the scale up in manufacturing is really needed. I would love to be able to talk about some of the other bits as well on sort of flexibility. If you want to have a chat about grid flexibility and all the different things around that, come have a chat with me, because that's a pet area of mine. But yeah, I guess the final thing will almost just be to echo what Emma was saying about just the idea that you don't need to sort of treat this as an either-or situation. We also need to decarbonise our industries, right, at the same time as decarbonising everything else. So this is not a sort of a zero-sum game where if we don't decarbonise here, it increases elsewhere, we can do everything, or we should be doing everything.
We should have also said, by the way, and it's kind of like further down the curve for decarbonisation, and so I'm mainly yelling at the government about heat, but like how we decarbonise our existing industries is also really important, and there hasn't been enough thought about the support that we give them. I was on the government's energy efficiency task force for a while, and there was a lot of really good work done by Make UK. My old chairman at Energy UK is at Make UK. There are increasing technological innovations, but also focus on things like energy efficiency, just kind of reducing energy demand, which is a key input for a lot of our manufacturing sector. They had some really good recommendations. I think they were, spoiler alert, they were probably the most advanced of the energy efficiency task force. I'd really like to see government pick them up. I'd like more thinking about that space. And then if you cannot transition industries, what we do with workers, communities, how we make sure people can move into jobs in new industries, all of that kind of thinking, because I think we've learned from coal and previous energy transitions that we need to do it better.
Okay, we've got time for, I think, 2 more questions. We take. And
hi, and thank you. I really want to applaud all the comments from the panel today. Yozella Farmer, Chief Executive of BEMA. We're the representative trade body for manufacturers of electrical products. So we are, really at the forefront of that conversation with manufacturers day to day on their investment decisions in the UK and abroad. It's a really complicated conversation when you talk about supply chains. I like the phrase, it's not just wings and wheels. We don't represent wings and wheels. It's the kind of nuts and bolts of how you build a grid, the componentry that goes into a substation. And these are complex, high-value products, really complicated supply chains. How do you mobilize this kind of very urgent conversation with government? And urgency, I think, is really important there, with a very complex supply chain. And I say that from the perspective of we haven't always, as BEMA, been brought into these conversations. We're really encouraged to hear so much enthusiasm for that industrial strategy, but we want to make sure it factors in not just wings and wheels.
Yeah.
Thank you. Richard McCarthy, I'm the chair of the Smart Meters Data and Communication Company, which is the regulated monopoly provider of the telco network. This is not a parochial point, this is a national point, which is about picking up on what Emma talked about the need for flexibility. What seems to have got lost from the narrative and from the political focus is a smart energy system underpinning the development and investment in low carbon, in smart energy generation. And I'm slightly bemused by this, actually. It just doesn't seem to be politically sexy at the moment. If we're going to hit our targets, we need a system that is smart. We need to not just ensure that it's flexible, it needs to incentivize us as individuals more, and it needs to incentivize business when to draw down power, how to use it, and it needs to manage the storage in a really smart way. So I don't decry anything that we're doing now. I think it is a genuinely exciting time. But do you agree that we need smart energy, a smart energy system, as part of our central narrative?
Is it going to be a yes or no answer for Josh is eager to chip in. Josh, I'll come to you and then I'll come to you, Luke.
I just love that someone came back on flexibility, so thank you for that. So I think yes is the answer. We do need a smart energy system. I think ultimately we need to work out what we need, what we're sort of talking about. With grid flexibility, we have battery storage as a huge pipeline with National Grid, so it is something that's sort of going ahead right now. We know that National Grid ran trials during the pandemic of having inviting people to switch off their energy, and I think there's only a million people sort of joined it and sort of started to have their sort of energy bills reduced. So we know that there's some appetite there.
2.5 gigawatts we got off that.
Yeah, and so we know that that's something that's starting to happen. So yes, we do need to be smarter. The one thing I would perhaps sort of point to or contend on is I don't think we should necessarily assume that everyone is going to be very proactive in engaging with a sort of smart energy system, and that's why we need to make it easy for people to do that. So I think that one of the things we've sort of talked about in the past is sort of the idea of a kind of what does a customer charter look like, because we shouldn't, there are people who engage in these agile tariffs, and that's great, it's really welcome, but not everyone is going to have the chance to do that. Not everyone's going to have the time or headspace to do that. But if you have a system where you can say, well, we can agree that within a certain hour or window or whatever, we're happy for our fridge to be turned off for like 30 minutes or whatever, and we sort of know that's happening, we've signed up to it, but we don't have to sort of press a button to sort of make that happen, then yeah, we can move towards those sort of smart solutions, and demand-side response on that respect is going to be really useful. It is part of the puzzle though, so it's not the only thing in town. It will be battery storage, it will be interconnectors, there'll be lots of sort of parts of that, but in general, yes, I agree with that overall point.
Emma's keen to come in. Do you want to do a very quick intervention and then I'll come to Luke?
Are you saying my answers are normally long? That's not like me.
I think we can keep it punchy in the interest of time.
Absolutely, this is the BEMA answer. In my last job, we used to spend our time being like, stop talking about manufacturing wind turbine blades and start talking about like helicopters, the cables that we've got in this country, the composite manufacturing skills we've got in this country, 200,000, 300,000 heating installers who are going to be the kind of skilled workforce of the future for heat. Like, I completely agree that the conversation about jobs gets a bit like gigafactories instead of like, oh, the whole economy maybe, I don't know. And like related to that, one of the things that the UK is very good at is R&D in smart technologies and innovation for the kind of I call them like the things that stick the system together. Honestly, the problem is that I think it's a lot of like quite boring regulatory work that the government, like we've been trying to get something called half-hourly settlement done for pretty much as long as I've been working, which would really help us with flexibility and smart tariffs and things. Yeah, and also, and this is another point, the reason I bang on about retail policy and your energy supplier often is those are the companies that are spending the money innovating on things like, you know, better smart meters, smart tariffs, flexibility. They're going to be the companies that stick it together, but they're mostly loss leading. And so we should absolutely do it. We are behind like telco and other areas of the economy in this stuff. A lot of it is like detailed regulatory work, and it requires the energy regulator to work much more closely with the government. My last thought is we have actually got early days a minister in the retail brief in Miata Fambulla who really likes energy retail, and I have been doing this 14 years, and no disrespect at all to the ministers I've worked with before, but everyone gets excited about like hard hats and building stuff. Very few ministers are like, I want to do something which is really deeply regulatory and where I can't stand next to it, but I think she might, and so we might get some of that like services, customers, flexibility, regulatory stuff done while she's a minister, and that's quite exciting for us.
In fact, in the interest of
That
time,
wasn't
I'm
short,
thinking,
sorry.
actually what we might do is, if I invite, whether there's anything in sum up you or Josh want to add, and then I'll come to Luke for a final closing remark. I think picking up on those issues around managing complexity, but also just that sort of ensuring, going back to what we heard from Ed and Heather, ensuring that speed and fairness is baked into Labour's clean energy mission. So, and if there's a single sentence you want to add into there, Josh or Emma, then we'll come to Luke before we close.
Yeah, sure. It's actually almost sort of pinching a conversation that we had with Heather yesterday. Was very, very generous with sort of giving her time speaking to all of us. And we were just describing to her how we'd recently sort of merged our sort of, you know, energy team with our economy team. And she said, no, you haven't. You're an economy team. We are all sort of climate economists. And I do sort of think, sort of, based on the sort of breadth of discussion we've had today and all the different areas where we agree we need action on, I think that, you know, the climate economy is everything, and other departments may not realise it yet, but it is everything. How's that for a closing remark?
Full stop. Luke, over to you
I mean, just very quickly on those points. I mean, I basically just I agree. I mean, you know, we do. I mean, we need to industrialise everything as much as possible, do everything that we can in the background, and then at the household level and with people, we need to make sure that we make it as easy as possible. And I would agree with you, and happy to have a chat afterwards about how we ensure that's part of the government's thinking, although I'm sure it is. I mean, I guess where I would link it, and when you were talking about fairness, is, and again, when we're thinking about retail market reform or smart energy systems, is that in order to bring the public with us, we need to ensure that it's just made incredibly easy, and business is incredibly good at that and innovating, and you know that's business knows how to sell products to people, and I think business has got a really important role in, and you know the retail suppliers and others in innovating in understanding how consumers actually think and interact with the energy system, and government has got to work really closely with business to ensure, you know, around that fairness piece, and that's also true of workers. We've got to make sure that mission-based approach genuinely brings everyone in. It brings workers in, it brings business in, but it also brings the public in, and that's ultimately how you ensure that we move fast and don't break things, but actually build things.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Josh. With that, we'll bring it to a close, so thank you very much.